The wind over the Dakota prairie was a sculptor of bone. It stripped the land to its skeletal truth, carving gullies from sandstone and howling a lonesome sermon through the cottonwoods that clung to the frozen creek bed. For Corbin, the sound was a penance. It was the only voice that had spoken to him for 3 winters, and its language was one of profound and unforgiving solitude. His cabin was a scar on the landscape, built from the bones of trees he'd felled himself, dug into the side of a long, sorrowful ridge. From his single window, he could see the place where the world had broken. A shallow, stony wash that the Army maps had called Whitestone Creek. He called it nothing at all. He only watched it, the way a man watches the grave of someone he failed to save. He had been a scout once, a man who could read the land's secrets in the bend of a blade of grass or the flight of a hawk. He'd guided the blue-coated cavalry, his silence and skill a weapon they'd aimed at the heart of the very wilderness that had raised him. He'd quit them after Whitestone Creek, after the screaming had stopped and the only sound left was the crackle of burning lodges and the low, stunned weeping of the wind. He had taken his pay, his shame, and his horse, and ridden north until the world forgot his name. Here, on this ridge of memory, he had begun his exile. This day, the wind carried something new. Not the scent of snow or the dust of distant herds, but a thin, metallic tang that coiled in the pit of his stomach. Blood. He pulled on his worn sheepskin coat, the leather cracked like old earth, and took up his rifle, more from habit than intent. He moved down the ridge not with the confident stride of a hunter, but with the cautious, heavy steps of a man approaching a verdict. There, half submerged in the ice-choked shallows of the creek, was a body. Small, wrapped in a tattered trade, blanket the color of a faded sky. His first thought was a wolf kill, a stray calf from some far-off ranch. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something terribly human. It was a girl. Lakota by the intricate beadwork on the moccasins that poked from the blanket. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 winters old. She lay on her side, her face turned away from him, her black hair fanned out in the crystalline water like a spill of ink. The snow around the creek's edge was not white, but a lurid, shocking pink. He knelt, the cold of the stones seeping through the knees of his canvas trousers. He expected the stillness of death, but as he reached out a hesitant, trembling hand to touch her shoulder, a shudder ran through her frame. A sound escaped her lips, not a word, but a dry, rattling gasp, like the last leaf clinging to a branch in a winter storm. Gently, he turned her over. Her face was a mask of cold and pain, her skin the color of old ash. Her eyes were closed, her lashes frosted with ice. And in her side, just below her ribs, was the wound. It was not the clean slice of a knife or the ragged tear of an animal's claw. It was a deep, circular puncture, brutal and ugly, the flesh. Around it bruised a sickening black purple. Lodged deep within it was a jagged shard of iron. Corbin recognized it instantly. It was shrapnel, a piece of a shell from a Hotchkiss gun, the kind the cavalry used to turn encampments into slaughterhouses from 1,000 yards away. He had seen wounds like this before. He had seen them in the bodies of warriors, of women, of children, lying in the smoldering ruins of their homes by the creek below. The memory was so vivid it stole the air from his lungs. The shrapnel in her side felt like a piece of his own history, a splinter of his own damned soul that had found its way into the flesh of this child. To help her was to invite the very world he had fled. Her people, if any were left, would follow. The soldiers, if they found her here, would see a traitor. To leave her was to become the monster he already believed himself to be. It was no choice at all. It was a sentence, long delayed, finally being carried out. With a groan that was part effort, part prayer, he slid his arms beneath her. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of cold twigs and wet wool. As he lifted her, her head lolled back, and her eyes fluttered open. they were not the unfocused eyes of delirium. They were dark, ancient, and unnervingly clear. They looked not at his face, but through it, as if seeing the ragged, haunted landscape of his soul. Her lips parted, and a single word, a whisper of frosted air, escaped. Itaskang. The word was Lakota. It meant chief or leader. It was not meant for his ears. It was a name, a memory, a prayer to someone who was not there. He carried her up the ridge, each step an agony of remembrance. The wind picked up, screaming its lonesome song around them. High above, a single hawk circled in the vast gray emptiness of the sky, its cry sharp and piercing, like a nail being driven into the silence. It sounded like a judgment. The cabin was a cramped, smoky womb, smelling of pine tar, stale coffee, and regret. It held a cot, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and the crushing weight of Corbin's solitude. Placing the girl on his own cot was like laying a ghost to rest. The space, which had been only his, was now shared. It felt crowded, violated, and yet, for the first time in years, it felt like it had a purpose beyond mere existence. He worked with a grim, focused desperation. He built the fire high until the small room was a sweltering box of heat, the stones of the hearth hissing as stray drops of melted snow fell from his coat. The girl, Onzilla he would later learn her name was, lay still, her breathing a shallow, erratic rhythm that seemed to falter with every beat of his own anxious heart. He was no hero. He was a vessel of shame. As he carefully cut away the frozen fabric of her buckskin dress from the wound, the images came unbidden. The faces of the 7th Cavalry, men he'd ridden with, men whose laughter had turned to bloodthirsty yells at Whitestone Creek. He remembered Lieutenant Davies, his face flushed with a righteous fire, screaming, "No quarter! Cleanse the valley!" He remembered the smell of gunpowder and burning hide, a smell so thick it felt like you could drown in it. And he remembered one man, a Lakota elder, tall and defiant, standing before his painted tipi, not with a rifle, but with a feathered staff held high. The man had not charged or yelled. He had simply stood there, his face a mask of profound sorrow, his eyes meeting Corbin's across the chaos. Corbin, tasked with spotting for the Hotchkiss crew on the ridge, had lowered his field glasses for a fraction of a second, a moment of sickening refusal. It hadn't mattered. The gun had roared, and the tipi, the man, the world he represented, had vanished in a cloud of dirt and red ruin. Corbin carried that man's face inside him. It was the face he saw in his nightmares, the face that had driven him here. The girl on his cot had the same high cheekbones, the same proud line of her jaw, 2 wounds, 1 shelter. His was invisible, a cancer of the soul. Hers was a physical manifestation of the same violence, a piece of the same shell that had shattered his world. She did not speak. When the warmth of the fire finally thawed her, she began to tremble, not from cold, but from a deeper tremor that seemed to originate from the bedrock of her memory. Her eyes, when they opened, were fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. She did not watch them with the simple fascination of a child. She stared into them as if she were watching something burn. A home, a family, a life. Her gaze was not vacant. It was full, burdened with visions he could not imagine. The fire was not a comfort to her. It was a witness. He cleansed the wound. As best he could, his hands, usually steady with an axe or a rifle, clumsy with this delicate, terrible work. The shrapnel was lodged deep, against a rib. To pull it out could cause a fatal bleed. To leave it in meant infection, a slower, more agonizing death. He had no surgeon's tools, only a skinning knife he sterilized in the flames and a bottle of whiskey he used more for cleaning wounds than for drinking. He held the bottle to her lips. She turned her head away, a flicker of defiance in her dark eyes. He didn't force her. Instead, he soaked a clean rag in the fiery liquid and began to clean the edges of the wound, She flinched, a sharp intake of breath, but made no other sound. Her stoicism was more unnerving than any scream. It was the silence of someone who had already seen the worst the world had to offer, and this was merely an echo. They were two ghosts under one roof, trapped in a bubble of silence that felt louder than any battle. His guilt and her pain swirled in the small space, a palpable, suffocating presence. He would move to add a log to the fire, and his shadow falling across her would make her stiffen. She would shift on the cot, a soft rustle of the blanket, and he would freeze, feeling like an intruder in his own home. He had brought the violence that had broken her world into this last sanctuary. Now the ghost of that world was lying on his cot, staring at his fire, judging him with her silence. The days that followed blurred into a fragile, dreamlike ritual. The world outside remained a canvas of gray sky and white earth, the wind its only artist. Inside the cabin, a strange, unspoken truce took hold. Corbin moved with a hushed reverence, his life pared down to the singular focus of keeping the flame of hers from flickering out. He remembered things he thought he had forgotten. Skills taught to him not by the army, but by Alara, his wife, who had been taken by a fever a lifetime ago. He remembered her hands, gentle and sure, grinding herbs with a stone pestle. He remembered the poultices she would make for his cuts and burns, her voice a low murmur as she worked. He ventured out into the wind-scoured landscape, not to hunt, but to gather. He dug beneath the snow for yarrow, its feathery leaves known to staunch bleeding. He stripped bark from the willow by the creek, chewing it into a paste to ease her fever, the bitter taste of communion with the land's own medicine. He brewed a thin, weak tea from pine needles, rich in life-giving essence. He would return to the cabin to find her exactly as he had left her, a still figure in the dim light, her eyes tracking his every move. He would prepare the poultice, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. As he applied the warm, damp mash to the wound, her body would tense, but she would not cry out. He began to talk to her, his voice rusty from disuse. He didn't speak of the present, of her wound, or their predicament. He spoke of Alara. He told the silent girl about the way his wife's hair smelled of summer rain, about the wildflower seeds she'd tried to plant in the unforgiving soil outside their first home, about the songs she used to hum while she baked bread. He wasn't talking to the girl. He was talking to the past, trying to fill the terrible silence with a ghost of his own, a gentler one. He was trying to prove, perhaps only to himself, that his hands were capable of more than just destruction. One afternoon, while changing the dressing, he found it. Tucked inside her blood-stiffened dress was a folded piece of canvas. Carefully, he worked it free. It was a section of a U.S. Army soldier's coat, the blue faded, the wool frayed. It had been used as a makeshift bandage, a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding before she collapsed. The irony was a physical blow. The very symbol of her people's destruction had been used in a futile attempt to save her. He took the scrap of blue cloth outside, dug a hole in the frozen earth with the heel of his boot, and buried it. He did not say a prayer. He simply covered it, erasing the last visible trace of the world that had sent them both into this exile. When he came back inside, something had changed. The girl had pushed herself up to a sitting position. Her eyes were no longer on the fire, but on the floor. With a slender finger, she was drawing in the thin layer of ash and soot that had settled near the hearth. Corbin stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was not a child's idle doodle. It was a shape, a symbol. A circle with 4 lines radiating from it, pointing to the cardinal directions. Then, inside the circle, she drew another smaller one. It was the Hanjeleka Wantagzena, the sacred hoop, the symbol of the Lakota universe, of the interconnectedness of all things. It was a map of the world he had helped to shatter. He said nothing, did nothing to disturb her. He watched as her finger traced the lines again and again, a silent, meditative act, It was a prayer made visible. A few days later, her fever broke. The angry redness around the wound began to fade, the swelling to subside. She started to take the pine needle tea from the tin cup he offered, her small hands wrapping around its warmth. And then she began to hum. It was not one of Ilara's songs. It was a low, guttural, and deeply resonant melody. It was a sound that seemed to come not from her throat, but from the earth itself. It had the rhythm of a slow-beating heart, the cadence of a ceremonial chant. Corbin felt the hairs on his arms stand up. The song was not for him. It was not a song of healing or of thanks. It was a call. It filled the small cabin, pressing against the log walls, seeping out into the vast, listening silence of the prairie. She was humming for someone who was watching. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a stage. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was the held breath before a storm. He looked out the window at the endless expanse of snow and felt for the first time not alone, but exposed. The fragile dream was ending, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any winter wind, that he was about to wake up. The dawn came not with light, but with a thickening of the fog. It rolled down from the ridge, a silent gray. Tide, swallowing the world and muffling all sound. It was a world without edges, without distance. Corbin stood by the window, a tin cup of coffee growing cold in his hand, his gaze lost in the shifting vapor. He had not slept. The girl's humming had ceased hours ago, but the echo of it remained, a vibration in the air, a premonition. And then he saw it, a shape darker than the fog, moving with impossible silence. A horse and rider, emerging from the gray veil knot. 50 yards from the cabin, they did not approach. They simply stood, a statue carved from shadow and mist. The rider was a silhouette, a sentinel. Corbin's blood ran cold. He had expected pursuit, but this was different. This was not a hunt. This was an arrival. He remained frozen, watching. The silence stretched, becoming a physical pressure against his eardrums. Then another shape emerged from the fog to the left of the first, and another to the right, and another. They came not in a line, but as if materializing from the mist itself, fanning out in a slow, deliberate arc. 10, 20, more, all on horseback, all utterly silent. They were not painted for war. They wore simple buckskins and heavy buffalo, robes against the cold. They carried rifles, but held them rested across their laps, not in aggression, but as a simple fact of their existence. The land went quiet. The ever-present wind seemed to die, holding its breath. The only sound Corbin could hear was the frantic, panicked drumming of his own heart, a thunder in the suffocating stillness. Then the riders parted. A space opened in the center of their formidable line. Through it, a man walked. He was older, his face a beautiful, tragic map of resilience and sorrow. His long, gray-streaked hair was bound in 2 braids wrapped in otter fur. He wore no buffalo robe, only a simple hide shirt adorned with quillwork that told the story of his life. He was on foot, a sign of respect, or perhaps of a power so immense it had no need for the height of a horse. His hand rested on the shoulder of a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, who walked beside him with a solemn gravity that belied his age. The man stopped 20 feet from Corbin's door. His eyes, dark and piercing, met Corbin's through the glass. They held no malice, no overt threat. They held the weight of history, the power of a people who had measured time in generations, not in minutes. They held judgment. Corbin felt the floorboards beneath him tremble, or maybe it was just his own legs. The girl, Owanzila, was sitting up on the cot, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the man outside. She was not afraid. She was waiting. Slowly, deliberately. Corbin set his coffee cup on the table. He did not reach for his rifle. That would be a fool's gesture, an admission of a guilt they already knew. He walked to the door, his movements stiff and formal. He pulled it open, letting the cold, damp air rush in, carrying the scent of horses, wood smoke, and the damp earth. He stood on his own threshold, a lone man before a silent nation. The chief, for he could be nothing else, raised his chin slightly. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried across the frozen ground with the clarity of a bell. It was deep, resonant, and scraped raw by grief. "You touched one of ours." The words were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, of a law so fundamental it needed no explanation. "She is part of the Tiwia, the family, the people. You, the outsider, have laid your hands upon her." It was the gravest of trespasses and the most sacred of interventions. Corbin's throat was a knot of dust and fear. He could not speak. He could not explain that he had tried to save her, that he had buried the soldier's coat, that he had used his dead wife's remedies. Words were useless here. They were the currency of his world, a world of lies and broken treaties and empty promises. This world, the one that stood before him now, dealt in actions and consequences, so he acted. He stepped out of his cabin, off his threshold, and onto the frozen earth. And there, in the snow, before the chief and his silent warriors, Corbin dropped to one knee. He bowed his head, his gaze fixed on the ground at the chief's feet. It was not an act of fear. It was not a plea for his life. It was an act of atonement. It was the only true thing he had left to give. He was surrendering not himself, but his guilt, laying it bare for them to see. He was finally answering for Whitestone Creek. They did not kill him. Death would have been a release, a swift end to his long penance. What they did was far more profound. Two of the warriors dismounted and walked toward him. They did not grab him or bind him. They simply stood on either side, their presence an undeniable command. The chief, Mapie Sapa Black Cloud, nodded once. "Hugh Woe," he said. "Come." They led him from his cabin, from the small, lonely world he had built, and into theirs. The silent riders parted for him as they had for their chief, their faces impassive, their eyes following his every step. They walked for a mile, deeper into the folds of the prairie he thought he knew, to a place hidden from the world, a winter camp, nestled in a small wooded coulee, protected from the wind. Tippis, their hides darkened by smoke, stood in a circle. The smell of burning cedar and roasting meat filled the air. This was not a remnant. This was a community, alive and whole, hidden in the heart of the land that was supposed to have been cleansed of them. They took him to the largest tipi, the one belonging to Black Cloud. Inside, a fire burned in the center, its smoke rising to the opening at the peak. Painted hides lined the interior, depicting hunts, battles, and visions. They were the tribe's history, their memory written in art. Black Cloud gestured for Corbin to sit. Owenzila was already there, seated next to the boy who had walked with the chief. She was wrapped in a new, clean blanket of white wool. She looked at Corbin, and for the first time, her expression was not one of pain or distant trauma. It was one of quiet recognition. Black Cloud sat opposite him, the fire between them. He did not speak for a long time. He simply watched Corbin, his gaze stripping away every pretense, every lie Corbin had ever told himself. Finally, he spoke. "The girl you found is my brother's daughter," he said, his English slow and deliberate, "learned from missionaries or treaty councils. My brother was Wichaka Nagi, a spirit man, a holy man of our people." He pointed a long bony finger at one of the painted hides. On it was a depiction of a battle, of cavalry soldiers firing from a ridge into a peaceful camp, of a Hotchkiss, gun-spitting fire. And in the center of the chaos, one teepee stood, and before it, a man holding a feathered staff. It was the man from Corbin's nightmare, the man he had watched die at Whitestone Creek. "I was there," Corbin whispered, the words tearing from his throat. "I was a scout, on the ridge." Black Cloud's eyes did not change. "We know," he said, the words landing like stones. You were the one who lowered his glass. You were the one whose spirit turned away. This was the first shock. They knew him. They knew his one fleeting, useless act of rebellion. But the true reckoning was yet to come. My brother, Wachaka Nagi, had a vision the night before the soldiers came. Black Cloud continued, his voice dropping to a low, reverent tone. He saw his own death. He saw the iron rain that would fall upon our people. But he saw something else. He saw his daughter, Otanzila, lying by a frozen creek. He saw her spirit preparing to leave her body. And then he saw a man come for her. A Waziku, a white man. A man with a hollowed-out soul and a name like a shadow bird. Corbin. Flinched. Corbin, from the Latin corvus meaning crow or raven. A shadow bird. In my brother's vision, Black Cloud said, his eyes locking with Corbin's, this man did not harm her, he lifted her. He carried her to his own lodge. He cared for her not with a soldier's pity, but with a husband's grief. He paused, letting the words sink into the fire-lit silence. My brother saw that you would not be her savior. He saw that you would be her vessel. You were simply the answer to his dying prayer. You were the path she had to walk to survive. This was the second twist, the one that shattered Corbin's understanding of the world. His act was not his own. His choice was not a choice. He had not rescued a child. He had fulfilled a prophecy. The guilt he carried, the shame that had driven him into exile, had also been the key that led him to her. His sin and his salvation were the same thing. He was not a savior. He was an instrument of a power far older and deeper than he could possibly comprehend. Owanzila, the girl who had been silent for days, now looked at him. She spoke, her voice clear and soft, yet carrying the same weight as her uncle's. My father saw you, she said in Lakota, the words translated by the young boy beside her. He told me not to be afraid of the shadow bird, for his wings carried the memory of a love he had lost. He said your wound would recognize my wound. Corbin stared at her, this child who was not a child, but the keeper of a sacred vision. The last legacy of a holy man. He had thought he was nursing her back to health. All along, she had been the one seeing him, understanding him, waiting for the fulfillment of what she already knew to be true. He had come to this land seeking punishment. He had lived in exile, begging the silent landscape for a judgment that never came. Now here, in the heart of the people he had wronged, it was finally being delivered. He lowered his head, expecting the final blow. I was there, he said again, his voice cracking. I am part of the evil that did this to you. Punish me. This was his moment of irrational mercy, though he did not know it. He begged for the justice he deserved. Black Cloud looked at him, a strange, sad wisdom in his eyes. To punish you would be to defy my brother's spirit. It would be to say his vision was wrong, he said. We do not punish the vessel that carries the sacred water. We honor it. They did not give him peace. Peace was something you earned for yourself. They gave him something far more complicated. They gave him a place. That night, the drums started. It was not the fast, frantic beat of war, but a slow, deep, powerful pulse that was the heartbeat of the earth itself. The entire village gathered. In the center of the camp, where a great fire had been lit, its flames leaping toward the star-dusted sky. The air grew thick with the scent of burning cedar and sage, a holy incense to cleanse the world. Corbin stood at the edge of the circle, a prisoner of his own atonement, guarded by the same two warriors. He watched as Owanzila was led toward the fire by her uncle. She was no longer the wounded child from the creek. She was dressed in a dress of the purest white doeskin, adorned with intricate quillwork that shimmered in the firelight. Her hair was clean and shining, braided with eagle feathers. She looked like a princess from a myth. Corbin's heart seized with terror. He thought it was a funeral, a ritual to honor her spirit as it passed, or perhaps a sacrifice to appease the spirits for the desecration of her wound. He believed they had kept her alive only to give her a proper death. The protector in him, the part that had answered. A dying man's prayer surged. He took a step forward, intending to throw himself into the fire, to offer his life in exchange for hers, to stop this terrible, beautiful ceremony. The hands of the warriors on his shoulders were like iron. They held him fast. "Snala," one of them murmured. "Be still." Black Cloud led Owanzila before the fire. He raised his hands to the sky and began to chant, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the drums. He was not mourning, he was proclaiming. He spoke of her father, Wichaka Nagi. He spoke of his vision. He spoke of her journey through the shadow of death and her return. He spoke of her survival not as an accident, but as an act of immense spiritual power. He placed his hand on her head. "The girl who was wounded is no more," he declared, his voice ringing through the cold night air. "She has walked the spirit road and returned. We will no longer call her Onzela, for that name carries the memory of her pain. From this night forward, she will be known as Anpao Win." "Dawn Woman," a great cry of affirmation rose from the assembled people. Anpao Win, Anpao Win. She was not dead. She had been reborn. This was not a funeral, it was a naming, a baptism of fire and smoke. Corbin watched, his legs weak with relief and awe. The ceremony was beyond his comprehension. A sacred drama played out on a stage of earth and sky. Then, the unthinkable happened. Black Cloud turned, his eyes finding Corbin where he stood in the shadows. He beckoned to him. The warriors released him, and with a gentle push, urged him forward. He stumbled into the circle of light, his worn canvas clothes and pale, haunted face a stark contrast to the sacred pageantry around him. He felt the eyes of the entire tribe on him. He was the ghost at the feast, the symbol of the world that had tried to destroy them. He stopped before Black Cloud, his head bowed. "The vision was not only for her," Black Cloud said, his voice softer now. "It was for you. You were led here not to die, but to be found. You emptied yourself of your own people. You carry a great silence within you. Our people do not waste such things." He gestoken to Anpao Win. The newly named Dawn Woman stepped forward. She looked at Corbin, her eyes clear and deep as a forest pool. She reached out a small, steady hand and placed it on his bowed head. The touch was not one of forgiveness nor of accusation. It was a touch of acceptance, a claiming. It felt like the world held its breath. "You came to us as a shadow bird, a creature of grief and exile," Black Cloud proclaimed, his voice once again ringing for all to hear. "You fulfilled the Spirit's command. You will no longer be a man with no name, a ghost on the land. From this night, you will have a name. Among the Lakota, you will be known as Oi-8 Wakatuktuknaka." The young boy beside him, who was Black Cloud's own son, spoke the translation for him, his young voice filled with a strange pride. He who cares for the people. It was not a reward. It was a burden, a sacred, impossible task. They did not give him her hand. They did not give him a home. They gave him a name, a role, a reason to exist that was inextricably tied to their own survival. They had taken his shame and forged it into a responsibility. Corbin did not return to his cabin on the ridge. His old life, the one of solitude and silent remembrance, had been burned away in the light of the ceremonial fire. He stayed. He could not become one of them, could never truly bridge the chasm of blood and history that separated their worlds. But he could exist alongside them, a silent guardian, a man marked by a sacred trust. He did not take a wife. He did not build a new lodge. He lived in a small teepee near the edge of the camp, a perpetual outsider who had been given a place on the inside. He taught the young boys how to read the land, not with the cold eye of a military scout, but with the reverence of one who understands its spirit. He learned their language, not just the words but the silences between them. He sat in their councils, a quiet presence, his opinion never asked for, but his loyalty never questioned. Anpao Win grew into a wise and respected woman, a leader in her own right, and though they rarely spoke, a profound, unspoken understanding always passed between them. He was her living prophecy, the strange, sad man who had carried her back into the world. He grew old there. His hair turned the color of the winter snow, his face becoming as weathered and creased as the land itself. He saw children born, saw them grow, saw them learn the stories of their people. He watched as the world outside changed, as the reservations grew and the buffalo vanished, but in this small hidden coulee, a flicker of the old way remained, fiercely protected. He died on a cold autumn night, decades later, an old man sleeping peacefully by his small fire. They buried him on a high hill overlooking the coulee, facing the east, toward the rising dawn. There was no stone to mark his grave, for his story was not written in rock. It was woven into the fabric of the Tiwi hay, a strange and vital thread in their tapestry of survival. It was whispered in the winter lodges, a tale told to children about the power of visions, the weight of names, and the mysterious ways of the Great Spirit. His epitaph was never carved, but it was remembered, passed down from one generation to the next, a quiet testament on the canyon wall of history. He gave what the others never did, time and blood and silence.